If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People, have you ever experienced anything out of this world or paranormal? What was it? I went with my best friend during high school for summer vacation to his grandparents who live in the countryside in Japan. I stayed in his mom's old room, which has a small wall closet. Just above this closet was a smaller closet door, like 1.5 feet tall and about 3 feet wide, just above it. Weird design, but their house is old. The first couple weeks, I was pretty jet lagged and Japan is hot and humid, so I didn't really sleep at night. If my light was off at night though, I always felt uneasy about that small closet space. Something about it just felt darker than the rest of the room. Toward the end of the second week, I started to adjust to the time difference. One morning, I woke up and that small door was open. It was unsettling, but I closed it and just thought maybe it wasn't closed all the way and came loose. A couple nights later, I woke up feeling uneasy. It was dark and I could kinda see, and I could see that small door was open. It was much darker than the rest of the room, like black, pitch dark. This was the first and only time I experienced paralysis. I was too scared to move, say, or do anything. I just felt this darkness coming from there. I don't remember sleeping that night, but I must have because I remember waking up the next morning. I told my friend about it, who said his mom told him about something like that, too. When we got back home, and I talked to his parents, his mom kinda joked with me, "So, I heard you met the ghost." Not me, but a security guard I employed when I ran a dispensary. She showed me the video, in fact she sent it to me and I still have it on my phone. It's a camera mounted in her young daughter's room. She's playing on her bed, which suddenly slides away from the wall about 1 foot. The daughter then jumps off the bed and runs out of the room to tell her mom. Later, the daughter randomly got up, walked towards and out the front door while the mom was calling after her. Daughter snapped out of it once mom made physical contact. Daughter had no memory of how she got outside. Sue, security guard, calls a priest who literally goes by and tries to do like an exorcism on the apartment or whatever. About a week later, an electrical outlet behind a couch that she never used caught fire and the whole apartment building burnt down. I'm usually a pretty big skeptic, but I don't know how to explain the video. One weekend, I was at my dad's house. He'd come to the upstairs bathroom to get a shave and heard footsteps in my stepsister's room. I thought it was him walking around initially, so I got up to find him standing at her closed door. He looks back at me and whispers, "You can hear that too, right?" I nodded and he opened the door slowly. My stepsister was asleep, and never had been awake apparently. There was no way she could have crossed the room, gotten in bed, and pretended to be that convincingly asleep in the 2 seconds it took my dad to open the door. He went in, checked her TV which had never been on. She had one of those big ones from the 90s that would get warm when turned on. The radio hadn't been on either. Figured maybe it was the beat of a song or something. After that, we heard the footsteps a bunch of times, usually very early in the morning. Some of the footsteps were so heavy, they'd shake the ceiling fan of the dining room directly under her bedroom and they'd woken her up a few times as well. Whenever I'd shower at my dad's, I always felt like someone was standing behind me. Eventually, I got so stressed and paranoid that I refused to shower at the house or even go into the upstairs bathroom. My dad asked me one day, "Do you ever feel like someone's in the shower with you when you're here?" After months of me feeling that way and never mentioning it to anyone. When I was in my later teens, 16 to 18 range, I was staying up all night, probably playing League. My dad was working night shifts and my mom was sleeping across the house. My childhood dog, who was an old little grumpy lady at this point, gets up with the most energy I've ever seen an old dog get. First stood straight up, hackles raised, and she was growling in the meanest tone I've ever heard her growl. My dad wasn't supposed to get home from his shift for 6 hours. I took my headphones off and listened. Boot steps, stomping across the house. Really stomping, the type you do when you're a kid and mad and throwing a fit, but making the noise a grown man would, forcefully kicking the floor with each step. My mom was sleeping across the house. Alone. And someone had just broke in. I got my gun, hunting rifle, Mosin if you're curious, but you take what you can get, readied it, and set the dog loose. I exited and stared clearing the house, fully ready to end whoever had broken in. That this may be paranormal had not even occurred to me yet. I never found anyone. My mom was woken up by it and was ducking terrified. I found out my dad had an identical experience a month later, waiting for me and my mom to get home from work/school. They had the house blessed by a priest and it stopped. At my mom's old apartment I used to have this feeling I was always being watched. Then I was starting to wake up at 3 a.m. consistently. On one of the nights I had woken up, I heard someone call out my name. It was a woman's voice, but I didn't recognize it. She kept calling out my name and walking towards my bed, getting closer, but I didn't see anything. I freaked out, jumped off my bed, and ran into my brother's room. I hopped into bed with him and tried waking him up. The punk sleeps like the dead, he still sleeps like that. I heard her footsteps follow me until his doorway. After that, every time I woke up in the middle of the night, I just ran into his room and slept on the top bunk. We had bunk beds. My mother still doesn't believe that happened. Thankfully, we only lived there for a couple of months, then moved out. I began waking up every night around 3 a.m. feeling like something was about to hurt me. It was just this awful, knotted dread sitting in my stomach. My dog would often also wake up, hackles raised. There was a bathroom attached to my bedroom that I believe was the source of it. It had the worst energy. I always refused to use it. No matter how many times we changed the bulbs or tried to fix the wiring, the lights always flickered this ugly green color. The shower in it had a sliding door. Sometimes, when I would awaken at night, I would hear the door rattling in its frame, hard. The AC had not kicked on, and the fan was not on. It only ever happened around 3 a.m. I would lie awake, staring at the bathroom door, waiting for it to slide open. Fortunately for my sanity, it never did. The shower door rattled alone in the dark bathroom, slamming against the sides of its track, but the bathroom door itself stayed shut. I once had a friend sleep over, and he bolted awake around that same 3 a.m. time frame whilst I was ducking around on my computer. He turned to me and told me he had felt suddenly very afraid, and that he wasn't sure what had woken him up. I hadn't told him a thing about what I had been experiencing. Just before moving out, I went in to clean that bathroom to prep for the sale of the house. I heard a slight hum, like a woman singing. Nobody else was home, and no radio or television was on. I stopped to listen, as it was very quiet and very brief, and heard it again, directly in my left ear. Loud and clear. I bolted outside and did not come back in until everyone was home. My mother would not let me talk to her about it. She would very angrily shut me down whenever I tried to bring it up, loudly shushing me and saying she didn't want to hear it. I think she was afraid of something. My brothers later admitted they had tried to have a ghost hunt in what they felt to be my haunted bathroom while I was away at soccer practice one afternoon. Even they were wary of it. I'm still not sure if I was just crazy or not, as nothing outrageous ever happened. I just remember the constant fear. My brother and I, aged 12 and 9, were in sleeping bags in a spare guest room of my aunt's. She had just moved in and we were there to help unpack. It was well into the night, so we were asleep in the dark room. My eyes shot open because something was in the room. I didn't see it, but it felt like something was standing between my brother and I. Before I could think what I should do next, it started shouting down at us. Guttural gibberish, loud and angry. I start screaming my head off. My aunt bursts in and yells, "What's going on?" and my only response is to scream, "Turn on the ducking light." Nothing was there. It was quiet. My brother was curled up in a ball at the bottom of his sleeping bag. We went back to sleep, trying to convince myself that my brother had talked in his sleep or something. We never talk about it again. Fast forward, my brother is about leave for Marine boot camp. Having a beer and just chatting. He asks me if he can bring up a random thing that's always bugged him, and proceeds to tell his memory of that night. According to him, having heard my version, describes waking up to me screaming and something that seemed to be floating above us yelling at us in some weird language he had never heard before. Said he just wanted to get that off his chest before going off to war. Well, duck is pretty much the only thing I could respond with. When I was a teenager, me and some friends were using a Ouija board and nothing was happening. We took a break, moved on to other things like telling dirty jokes and listening to music. An hour or so later, 3 of us are sitting in my friend's bedroom talking and the board is still on the table in the middle of the room, when all of a sudden the planchette flies off the board and lands on the floor. Just like someone had quickly swatted at it with their hand. We didn't use it anymore that day. Camping at a friend's family property with a group of friends. They had a huge dingy shop full of old tools and old furniture that was super creepy. Dirt floor, clown paintings in the loft, not even kidding. We stayed up late drinking by the fire and I was the last one awake. Went to go pee on the side of the shop and stood about 5 feet away looking inside through the window. There was a fluorescent light on and I noticed what looked like a piece of paper or dollar kind of floating around. I thought it was a moth at first, but it was moving in a very flowing figure 8 pattern that was very rhythmic. It reminded me of dangling a carrot. I watched it for maybe 20 seconds, which felt like forever. Then it quickly floated back to the corner of the shop where it was dark. There was also a wood chair near the corner that added to the creepiness. Could have been a moth though. I sat back down by the fire to finish my beer and have a smoke. No one else was awake, so I played Robot Unicorn Attack 2 on my phone for a while. I noticed my friend Mark pop out of his tent to pee, then go back in to go to sleep. I decided sleep sounded good, so I went to my tent and fell asleep. The next morning, we were having breakfast and Mark said, "I saw you guys sitting by the fire super late. How late did you stay up?" I told him I was probably 2 or 3 a.m. Then he said, "Who was up with you?" I told him I was the last man standing. He said, "I got up to pee and saw you on your phone and 2 people over your shoulder watching you play." He said one person looked bigger, so he thought it was one of our friends, who was a bigger dude. He said the other person was taller and skinny, but none of us are noticeably tall, or skinny. Freaked me out. We still camp at that property once a year, but I don't go in the shop, and I go to sleep whenever my wife decides she's tired. There's a small community where I have my cabin. There was a horrible starvation one winter in the 1800s and most of the people in that town died. Somebody back then painted a woman, on her knees, holding a hangman's rope, and looking hopelessly into the painter's POV. Like stares into you ducking soul type of thing. There have been 4, I believe, documented owners of this painting since it was found in the 1920s. Every single one of the owners died by suicide, hanging. Eventually the painting was donated to the county and now it hangs in a coffee shop. Nobody wants to own it. If you didn't think that was creepy enough, my godson once looked at the picture while we were eating there, and randomly said, "It's so sad all of her children died." And when I asked him how he knew, he said somebody told him. This would be fine and everything except nobody knows who the woman is. Nor does anyone know who painted it. When I was maybe 6 or 7 I lived with my grandma in a double wide. You could sit on the living room couch and see all the way down the hallway. You'd see my bedroom doorway, the bathroom doorway, and then my grandma's bedroom doorway. Anyways, my grandma decided she wanted to play hide and seek for whatever reason. I saw her, clear as day, turn the corner and run into the bathroom. The bathroom door was in the middle of the hallway before the bedroom. I ran into the bathroom after her, turn the lights on and don't see her. I pull back the shower curtain, she's not there. There's literally nowhere else to hide. It was a small ass ducking trailer. At this point I get really freaked out and sad and start to cry. I backed up, facing the bathroom doorway until I hit the living room couch. I called out to my grandma a few times, no answer. This was super ducking weird for her, she never ever let me cry. My eyes flashed to the bedroom doorway for a second and my ducking grandma is standing there with this face that just put a pit in my stomach. Except she's not, because I hear her start talking from the bathroom, apologizing for making me cry, and asking why I didn't come look for her. While she's talking, the ducking bedroom lights flickered on and off, the bedroom doorway is empty, and my grandma walked out of the bathroom. I brought it up so many times and until the day she died she swore that I never came to look in the shower for her, that she was never in the bedroom, and that she'd never played a trick on me. She never once made me cry in my life, and I don't think she was the one who made me cry that day either. I'll never forget it. When I was left home alone, I'd hear thumps, noises, and feel a horrible presence to a point I would cry and scream for my parents. I couldn't move off of the sofa and enjoy any time I had alone, because it felt like I wasn't actually alone. I heard someone crawling on all fours down the stairs, stomping near the pet cages, walking around our bedrooms. It was disgusting, and I'd still have to recover for about half an hour when my family got back each time. One time it turned my radio on and started playing a very specific song that I'd never heard before. I used to question it. Was it friendly? Was it a person, or at least, shaped like one? Was it going to peek around the corner and stare at me? At one point I even thought it was a man, a toddler or a mutated child my age that was using our house as a hiding spot. One evening, my nose just started frantically bleeding. Being the weird kid I was, I left a handprint on the wall from it, next to a keyboard I highly suspected the thing would use as a hiding spot. Decorative purposes? I honestly couldn't tell you. What I can say though is that I wasn't expecting another one to appear next to it a week or so later. It was also in blood, way smaller, but in blood. That's when I kinda thought there could actually be someone, or something, stalking me. I've always wondered if it's a specific spirit or curse but no prevail. Neither of the handprints were mentioned. I tried to show it to my sister who was convinced she did it, but her hand was far too small. Whatever it was, I hope it's not watching me now. My father purchased some rural property about 12 years ago that has a cemetery on site. Descendants of the family are allowed to come and visit the property annually, which is really weird since about a dozen really old people led by a guy in his 50s show up and venture out into the woods. Anyway, when we were looking at the land prior to purchasing, my brother, my father, and myself went to walk it. We took random pics of the landscape, ponds, etc. Upon reviewing the pics we took, this one shows up I'll share. Unequivocally this dude was not with us, that is my brother and father in the background, 6 tall for reference, there is no misunderstanding or misrecalling the day. We absolutely freaked out. We contacted those Texas ghost hunter people and they were intrigued but nothing really came of it. Never saw the little guy again. He doesn't even look real, like Hess superimposed on the ground or something. Anyway, it's a strange piece of land, 14 marked graves, and according to the relatives about 40 slaves were buried out there who worked the land in the late 1800s. There is an area near where I grew up. They say the place is haunted and I can tell you that I did not believe in ghosts until I went there. When you enter the woods everything goes quiet. No birds, planes, cars in the distance. That's when creepy stuff happens. I went 3 times with friends. The first was at night and we heard screams off in the distance but it was really hard to tell where. All of our flashlights died and it was almost impossible to get back to our cars. Another time was during the day and after it went quiet we heard what sounded like heavy footsteps heading towards us but we did not see anything. Once it was in closer distance we ran back to the cars. The last was at night, we were determined to figure this place out, and again most of our flashlights died. We heard what sounded like an animal being killed but it was maybe 10 feet in front of us. Some of us hears voices in the distance. We stayed on the path but on our way back trees were laying in the path that were not there before. It's called Dudleytown and the shit still scares the hell out of me. I've had only one paranormal experience that I had trouble making a rational sense of. This was many years ago when I was in high school. I lived in an isolated community where ghost stories and paranormal stuff were pretty common. I thought nothing of the stories until one night. I was fast asleep as I had class in the morning. My room was also on the 2nd level of our house so I rarely woke up due to noise. All of a sudden I had a horrible nightmare. I can only describe it as seeing the woman at the ending of Wreck, a pale skinny humanoid figure, and then I heard the most awful scream / blood gurgling purse in my ear so loudly I immediately woke up in a sweat and heart beating out of my chest. As soon as I got my bearings, I heard someone coming into the house. Since I was not sleeping again anyway, I went to check it out, and this was at 3 to 4 a.m., so I was curious who it was. It was my mom, her friend and daughter, and they looked terrified. My mom didn't know either, as her friend only called and asked to be picked up ASAP. Neither of them could speak as first they were too scared. Eventually, she explained that she was down in their basement, putting wood in their furnace for the night. Then, in the corner of her eye, she saw this pale horrifying figure, and as soon as her eyes locked on it, this thing screamed at her so loudly it woke her daughter up upstairs. She booted it, grabbed her daughter and ran out of the house, and called my mom. I told her about my nightmare. What I saw and heard in my dream was identical to what she had just experienced. To make it even weirder, my mom had a Christmas present for another friend's baby in her closet. The whole night, it was going off as if someone was pulling the string on it, repeating, "Oh boy." It never did this for the weeks it was in there prior to that night. Needless to say, none of us slept a wink. I was about 7 years old, circa 1986. Went up north to my dad's cabin with my brothers and stepmom for a weekend. He lived off a small lake and had a fire pit in back. We had 4 lounge chairs that we had reclined all the way back to we were all laying down, gazing up at the stars. My dad was telling us some stories, then all of a sudden he shouts, "Wait. Oh my God. What is that?" Then points in the sky directly above. We all see it too. It looked to be a satellite moving across the sky. Then it stopped. Then it shot in a completely different direction very fast, stopped, changed direction, stopped. And so on for about 2 minutes. My dad yelled for my stepmom to grab the video recorder, which took a full-size VHS cassette. It was huge. And I recall him trying to explain what we were seeing and her saying, "It's probably a firefly," in which my dad says, "Yay. A firefly on crack." But just as she got to him with the recorder, it took off in blinding speed toward the horizon. Several reports were made apparently of people seeing the same thing. I'll never forget that. The house I lived at in college used to be a funeral home before it was converted to student housing 20 years ago. I was staying in the house alone during spring break and I decided to play some Xbox. Now, the PlayStation was plugged in at the time, and the outlet to switch them was underneath a little coffee table under the TV. I bent down under to switch them, and when I turned back around to get out from under the table, I saw what looked like the outline / shape of a human being with no face running out of my kitchen and straight at me. I closed my eyes and screamed out because I legitimately thought that I was being attacked by a burglar, but when I opened my eyes, the thing was gone. I had never believed in ghosts in my entire life until this happened to me. I called up my roommate and I drove an hour to his family's house and stayed the night there because I was so freaked out. Not sure if this was paranormal, but about 40 minutes into my 7 a.m. Sunday paper round in the UK when I was about 14 years old, I would go down one long road with a single house on it. I dropped my bike, looked up and down the long road. I could see about 400 meters in both directions. There was no one there. I then went to deliver the paper for 20 seconds or so, and as soon as I got back to the road there was a person approx 7 feet tall in a black cloak walking slowly down the middle of the road with no dog or anything. A person walking alone in this area at that time would have seemed on in itself. I genuinely could not see a face or anything, just black cloak, Grim Reaper without the Reaper kind of thing. Frozen getting on my bike, I waited for a short moment to see if I could process a face, but I couldn't, and at about 30 meters away, the thing was walking directly at me whilst I was on the side of the road. At that moment, just like any rational person would do, I pedaled as hard and fast as I could out of there and didn't look back. I traveled about a mile before I stopped and then continued with my paper round oddly. Used to ask my dad to join me on that bit of the paper round though for a couple of months after that and never saw anything again. Had an entity visit me in my room every night. I would feel and see the indent it left on the mattress. Physically see, hear and feel the springs cave in under the weight on an invisible force. Every single night. I would feel it play with my hair, and touch my face. I handled it with full denial. Just pretended it wasn't happening as best I could. One day I was arguing with my dad on the phone. It didn't like that, I guess. I had a closet door that was off the hinges, leaning against the wall. The door flung forward so hard it hit the corner of my dresser and left a huge hole in the door. My dad heard the noise of the door and asked what that was. I was stunned. Told him the door to the closet just flung forward? Like I said, we were arguing, so he was just agitated and didn't believe me and said doors don't just fall that hard. I know. Then one day as we were doing our nightly routine of it crawling into bed with me and me trying my best to ignore its existence, it decided it was sick of being ignored, and grabbed my arm so hard it yanked my arm up. I screamed bloody murder, ran faster than I ever have in my life, ran up the stairs, and slept on the couch next to my dad who happened to be asleep in his chair that night. I honestly think it felt bad for scaring me because I never saw or heard from it ever again. After years of convincing myself I must have just had a months-long psychosis that I do not speak of. My dad one day asks me if I ever experienced anything weird in his basement at his old house. He had experienced everything I had described a few years later when he made his man cave down there after I had moved out. When I was a kid, our dog went missing one night. It was already dark and a storm was coming. My parents decided we would grab some flashlights and go look for him. We drove down the road and parked off the side and just started calling his name. My sister and I walked into a big field and a lady just appeared out of nowhere. She had a dress on and she was holding an old lantern. She asked us what we were doing. We told we were looking for our dog. She told us to get off her property. We started to walk away and she just disappeared right in front of us. My sister and I knew we saw a ghost. We found out later that field we were in was an old graveyard. Most of the tombstones were knocked over or broken. To this day, nobody believes us. We know what we saw that night. When I was about 12-13, I had a friend spend the night. We spent a good part of the night watching YouTube and telling scary stories before I offered to go make us some popcorn and some sweet tea. It's the South, a must-have. My house was relatively small and the kitchen was conjoined with a dining room. My grandmother kept a large china plate display in the dining room, and through it you could see the entire kitchen reflected in it. While I was pouring our tea, I glanced over at it, and in the reflection standing behind me, which didn't make sense, as my grandmother kept her folded up treadmill in that spot, was the tallest woman I've ever seen with long black hair to match, no face. Scared me so bad my legs gave out and I screamed my friend's name. The house was dead silent, my dog didn't even come, so I scooped up the tea and popcorn and scrambled back to the bedroom. When I got in there I was angry she hadn't answered when I'd called out for her. I had a small house and there was no way she didn't hear me, but she swore up and down that she didn't and was confused. When I explained what had happened and described the scary figure in the reflection, she broke down, I'm talking sobbing, and kept saying it follows me everywhere. Needless to say, the subject was dropped and I didn't invite her back over. Never seen such a clear reflection like that since, and I'm just glad it went back home with her, whatever it was. When I was in high school I spent the summer in Europe where my mother grew up. I was sleeping in her old house and the sheets got pulled right off of me. I mean a full-blown yank. It jolted me awake and scared me to death because it was so aggressive. A few days later, I was trying to get into the house. It is unoccupied for years at a time now that we live in NY, and I couldn't get the key to turn. I kept trying and then the key pushed out of the lock and shot out onto the floor behind me, as if it was pushed from the inside out. I was totally creeped out, but I had no choice but to go in. Nothing was there, of course. Finally, I was alone again, and in my room, and a horrible male scream echoed from the hall. The entire house was made of sandstone and marble, so it resonated through every room. Went right through me. The chills that sound sent froze me solid. I started to cry instantly. I knew it wasn't human. It was so angry. I ran as fast as I could and got out of there. My grandmother was in Turkey for a few days and I was all alone, so I ran to my cousin's house until she came back. When she came back, I never stayed in that house alone again. I was 17. Once, while staying near Amsterdam, Den Haag, on vacation while my dad was working, I saw a child ghost. Always the frugal one, my dad had booked a cheap Airbnb a bit away from where he needed row work. It was a townhouse that was 3 stories and very old feeling, but antiquely pleasant. I had a bed with the headboard backed up to the window, and I distinctly remember being about to fall asleep when the running laundry machine started to make a slamming noise, as they sometimes do. I remember it being very loud and very rhythmic, and somehow it drew my vision up a bit where out of the corner of my eye I saw a toddler-shaped shadow push on the shadow of the window and tumble out. As it pushed on the frame, I swear I heard or felt a yell and panic. I remember waking up super hard, sitting bolt upright, and running to my parents' room. Near my mama's old house, that she had until recently, was a family that moved out in a hurry. Apparently, their daughter had developed a rapport with an imaginary friend, named Emily if I recall correctly. Emily would draw with the daughter, play dolls with her, etc., fairly normal imaginary friend stuff. The parents didn't think anything of it until Emily started to want to take the daughter to the park, on walks. Activities away from the house. The red flags were completely raised when the daughter mentioned Emily wanted to take her to the lake to go swimming. Very weird imaginary friend behavior. The parents, having a gut feeling about what may have been going on, went to the courthouse and checked the list of previous tenants of the house they were now settled in. They went through pages of information, including pictures, occupations, dates, their young daughter helping, until finally, in the 1920s or so, the girl suddenly points and says, "That's my friend Emily." The woman's name, of course, was Emily. And I'm sure you can guess how she died. They noped the duck out of there. Which honestly, seems very smart. My dad owned a farmhouse built during the 1700s. It was a bit beat up, but I loved it having a huge yard, his own gun range. Many times, I'd be sitting in the living room watching TV with my dad, stepmom and 2 stepsisters, and you'd hear a woman humming. Or doors would open on their own. People walking around upstairs when everyone was out of the house, or downstairs. The worst one, I went into the barn house that was used for storage, but used to have cattle. Walking or standing in the old stalls, you could hear someone walking above you with boots on, steadily but slowly. But I decided to go in by myself one time, after my stepsisters and I had been in there for about a half hour with nothing to show. About 2 minutes after walking in and standing there, I heard the sound of boots on wood running directly at me and I ran as fast as I could out the door. Before that, my dad lived in an apartment, and someone had been stabbed in the building years before. When my dad first met my stepmom, he had her and her kids move in, taking my room. So when I was there 2 times a month, I would sleep on the couch. My dad would see it too, but I would almost always see a figure, standing by the door in the corner of the kitchen, watching over me. We called him George. The worst one, that may be a figment of my imagination as a kid, was when I first decided to be brave and sleep with the lights off. I always had trouble sleeping, and usually had nightmares and night terrors. Not even a minute after my mom's boyfriend turned off the light and closed the door, I saw an expressionless mask that looked like a comedy/tragedy mask you'd see at a theater, but white. I could see through the eye holes, and there was no mouth. It slowly hopped toward me about 10 feet away, until it started getting closer and hopped faster. I screamed for him to come back, and as soon as he turned the lights back on, it vanished. I do have a voice recording on my old phone when I was a kid, where I got a reply to asking the question if the ghost that was there was afraid of my mom, and it said yes. That house had some duck shit happen, because too many times my door would slam shut with my window closed, and my mom would yell at me for it, saying I'm lying about not doing it, and getting punished for it. Friends would sleep over and we'd stay up trying to catch things happening. Not quite haunted house but definitely unexplained. Was out walking with my partner a few years back and we heard the most horrific howling noise. The walk was public along a river and it was a bright day, so there were other people out too. We looked down the path to see this skinny dog poking its head through a fence and howling into the river. I've never again heard a dog make that sound. It was in clear distress and it was so uncomfortable to watch. We stopped walking and turned towards the dog to see what had happened, but noticed how strange it was that no one else stopped or even acknowledged the howling. We waited for a while until we were sure the dog had no owner and then decided to see if we could get closer. Cautiously we didn't want to scare the dog in case it attacked. As we were approaching, the dog took off back down the path, so we followed until it turned a corner. This was the second strange part. The path turned into some fields that extended under a bridge. We weren't far behind the dog at all, maybe about 15-20 meters? But when we got to the fields it had completely disappeared. At this point we thought the dog had just run into the woods, but it seemed hard to believe as we were so close behind and there was no sign of another owner. We decided to carry on walking the direction we were now headed, and after only a few minutes, when we reached the path underneath the bridge, we suddenly saw just in the verge about 7/8 small gravestones, covered in weeds and with dog names/ages inscribed on the stones. After getting back home and doing some research, we found the area was fairly well known as a pet cemetery. Since the 70s, that area under the bridge had been used for people to bury their pets. Gave us the creeps. It felt like we'd been led there by the dog, which we never saw again. The house I grew up in was haunted and I have many stories. I think the biggest one was my interaction with an orb. So my dog at the time had her spleen burst and we had brought her to the ER. We had to go home and were told we would be called for any updates. My dad was out of town and had called for updates. When he called, the power went out and disconnected the phone. I ran upstairs to my parents' room where the only landline was. My dad has called back and I told him the power had gone out. As I hung up the phone I had turned around to go back downstairs. I was walking towards the hallways when I saw it. This levitating bright white/blue orb turned the corner of the stairs and started coming towards me. The orb was the size between a cantaloupe and a volleyball. It had a smoky aurora. As it got closer I froze. It seemed like the time had stopped. When it touched my chest, went into my body, I felt a level of content. I felt like everything was going to be fine. Immediately after, the lights in the house came back on. Learning more about the paranormal, orbs are quite rare and only happen when there is a lot of energy present. Definitely an interesting experience. I have 2 incidents to this day I've never been able to fully explain without just saying it's some sort of paranormal activity. One time was when my high school friends and I were partaking in some, back then, illegal activities at our buddy's house. For some reason we thought it was a good idea to hotbox the 1970s travel van that sits in his driveway. So we're out there having a good time when the door locks and our buddy feels air brush up against his leg. We freak out and run into the garage where we sit in a circle and continue our activities. He's telling us how that was his mom's van and she passed away when he was young from cancer. Suddenly there's a knock on the large garage door originating from where the van was slowly moving towards the entry garage door, which was closed. I heard it first and thought I was imagining it until I asked if my friends heard it. We all froze, and about the time it made it halfway across the main garage door we bolted out into the house. At this point we were freaking out and someone mentioned how cold it was in the house. Being summer and 65 degrees, it was oddly too cold. We all just ran from the house and didn't come back that night. Still can't justify that it was just the substances we were consuming and that something was really there. The other time was at my parents' house. My dad and brother had an instance prior this where my brother heard music coming from the attic. He woke my dad and they went upstairs to check. It was a Christmas globe that had a wound-up music box. It was July and it was outside the storage box. Mom claims she didn't put it there and no one had been up there in months, so we don't know how it wound up. At the same house, I'm upstairs sleeping. I awake in the middle of the night with my eyes fluttering, seeing a silhouette in front of me. I lose my breath for a moment before I grab my pillow next to me and swing it at this shadow. My eyes open and nothing's there. I just sit in the bed for a few minutes staring into nothingness, wondering if I truly saw something or not. My house is in the semi-rural Appalachians. Rural in the sense that it's 5 to 10 miles to the nearest gas station, semi in the sense that there are a couple of subdivisions within walking distance. Still, it's mostly fields in all directions. I used to walk across my yard every night a little after dark to close the door to my chicken house so no predators could get in. I did this every night with no problems. Nothing ever bothered me, I had zero fear of the dark, and I honestly kind of enjoyed the peace. One night in late spring I walked out there just like I always did, using my phone as a flashlight so I wouldn't trip on anything. I got out there, counted the chickens to make sure there weren't any stragglers, slid the door to their house closed, and had just stepped out of their run to close the external door when every hair on my body stood on end. This horrible, icy feeling of primal terror washed over me and I instantly knew there was something out there, nearby, and it was dangerous. I stepped back into the run and locked myself inside. My hands were shaking. I froze and listened hard for anything, like breathing or footsteps or rustling grass, but I couldn't hear anything. Nothing. It was the countryside in spring and all the insects and frogs had gone silent. Then, clear and loud, a sheep started bleating a couple fields over. Then another. My neighbors don't own sheep. I called my dad and made him come escort me back inside. The second the beam from his flashlight hit my chicken coop, the terror disappeared and the night noises started coming back. The bleating stopped. I hadn't and haven't experienced anything like that before or since, and I don't intend to. I don't go outside after dark anymore. My chickens go in at dusk and no later, even if I have to grab them one by one and stuff them in their house. I have no idea what the hell terrified the ever-loving shit out of me that night, and I never intend to find out. I guess this counts as paranormal. Well, this happened last fall and I was on a road trip through Utah, and Arizona and Nevada. So after visiting the north rim of the Grand Canyon, I headed east and took Highway 163 through Monument Valley. What a scenic road, highly recommend, and went past Forrest Gump Hill but didn't stop and stayed in a funky little motel in Mexican Hat, Utah. Except for the beautiful scenery, very uneven full. So next morning, I decide to head back to FG Hill for some pictures, and after accomplishing that task, head back towards Mexican Hat. Now before you arrive in Mexican Hat, you navigate a very curvy road down to the San Juan River and cross a one-way bridge with stoplights, then back up the valley to the town. I would say it's about 20 miles. So I'm la-di-dawing back and I'm driving and become aware that it's taking too long to get to Mexican Hat. There's no obvious paved roads to mistakenly turn off, but I do turn on a road to see WTF is happening. I turn around and come to the stop sign and see the sign on Highway 163 pointing back the way I just came towards Mexican Hat. I somehow missed it. I remember nothing about the curvy road to the river, one-way bridge, or the town itself. I mean, holy shit. What's going on? Never had anything like that happen before or since and have no explanation. Yeah, I guess I could have just spaced it out, but it's a great road, so I was paying attention. Probably about 30 minutes worth of road and town I have no recollection of. Oh, for a dashcam, though I'm sure there's a rational explanation for it. It's a perfect landscape for alien activity down there. Hell, maybe I'm not even me typing this out. Maybe the real me is in a zoo on their home plant. My fiancé at the time and I went to visit my dad. He had just bought a property built in the 1800s as a place to eventually modernize and sell. It was still in great shape and he invited us to stay there for the weekend instead of bothering with a hotel. We arrived and, tired from our drive, pretty quickly found the master bed and bathroom to get ready for bed. While using the restroom, I noticed some cold drafts and heard some rhythmic pacing-like sounds coming from the wooden floors. I brushed the cold off without thought at the time and assumed my fiancé was just looking around room, even though the walking sound was more like a boot than a foot with socks hitting the floor. At any rate, we both went to bed and fell asleep pretty quickly. At some point, my fiancé is nudging me in the side. Sweetheart, sweetheart. She is whispering but has an urgency in her voice. I opened my eyes and my heart and blood went cold for a second. There is a faint white figure standing there, just looking at us at the foot of the bed. We both saw it as clear as day. What was even more jarring is that same draftiness I felt before was back. The figure had a feminine essence and somehow an 1800s look. Fiancé and I held hands under the covers, just sort of both awkwardly caught off guard. The thing we both remember now, aside from being a bit petrified, is that what didn't sense any hostility or malice, just a good 10 minutes of holy crap. The figure stayed relatively still, just sort of shifting her head back and forth like you would while looking at an item at a sale or something interesting. Then, as suddenly as everything started, the figure just went away. The rest of the time there we noticed other odd sounds and slept downstairs in the living room, all lights on. My dad also had a Corvette stored in the carriage house, but my fiancé insisted there was a bad energy, so we never went in and took it out for a spin. I was in the capital of Ashgabat, waiting for my apartment lease to be approved by the local council, so I had to stay at their hotel. For context, Turkmenistan is also one of the toughest countries to get into, and this was post-pandemic, so even their biggest hotel that used to house dignitaries was also empty and dusty. I fell asleep after video calling my boyfriend. I was awoken with my duvet lifted from one edge, bringing half of it diagonally midair and almost wavy, all while hearing chants by a male voice in my left ear in a language I didn't understand. It was so fast and rough. I tried reciting all the prayers, Quranic verses I could. I was born Muslim but I don't practice anymore, and it stopped for a short second, only to begin again with almost a mocking laughter in between the chants. At the same time I could feel my left hand fingers being pulled repeatedly. It ended as the sun rose. I immediately called my friend who was 3 hours ahead in time zone to just debrief and process what the duck just happened. Told this to some friends and local colleagues, and yes, they theorized some regional genes. Of course I checked the duck out of there that morning and moved into a staff boarding house. Most terrifying experience of my life. I have a haunted house in SC. It's an old plantation house that is abandoned now, but we still own it. One time we heard something jump off of a bed upstairs and footsteps right after. Like a dog. But the only dog in the house was right next to my feet. This sound repeated every 10-ish minutes for at least an hour. Only after I checked the room did the sound stop. Another time I was home alone and heard a loud crash. Like something got smashed. I ran to the dining room, where I heard the noise, and the giant painting above the fireplace was on the ground very broken. However, the giant nail holding the painting in place was still there, at an upward angle. The string to the painting was still intact. The only way that painting would have fallen is if something picked it up and smashed it. I then thought there was someone in the house, so I called the cops. This giant ex-football SC trooper showed up, tough as nails kind of guy. He searched the house with me, had his gun drawn, and was visibly shaking. He dropped his gun twice, shaking. He left shortly after not finding anyone, and floored it out of the driveway. Another time I was lying in bed sick, and there is a closet with an old door handle. It's also really hard to open. It had a giant latch and the wood door grinds against the floor. So here I am, in bed, and the handle starts turning. The door opens, just a crack, but it opened. I cow, but it ducking happened. I ignored it and went to bed, thinking it was a dream and I was just sick dreaming. You know how those dreams can get crazy. Well, I wasn't dreaming because when I woke up, boom, it was still open. The next day, still in bed sick, I remember vividly my right hind trying to strangle me. I know that sounds crazy, but I was choking myself and I couldn't stop. I had to use my left hand to stop myself. Eventually I regained control of my right arm/hand, but I never forgot what happened. Same room, same bedroom, it was the master bedroom. Another time I remember seeing a young girl walk the halls. She was wearing a blue dress and had blonde hair. She never did anything to me, didn't scare me, she was just there. She disappeared after walking into the green room, a room with green walls. This house has like 5 living rooms. There is also a graveyard next to the property. Over time the land was sold off, so we don't actually own the graveyard. In the graveyard there are graves going back to the 1700s and there is a grave of a baby. Definitely the original owners of the house. We also got shot at by a crazy neighbor one 4th of July. His name was Willie. Why do I know this? He came to our front porch one time, shirtless, to introduce himself. He had a giant scar on his back. He asked us to make sure to put away the lawnmower because people might try to steal it. The lawnmower was on the other side of the property, hidden. The only way he could have known we had one was if he was wandering our property. Anyways, he shot at us, barely missing my brother in the head. Willie's house burned down shortly after, with him in it. We don't go back there anymore.